Forests are large. I mean, that goes without saying, but it's not something you go out of your way to think about. Around 31% of the Earth is covered in forest. Thick trees reaching into the sky, just enough room between them for people to fit, almost like they desire to be explored. 31% doesn't feel like a large number. That is until you find yourself lost in one. Then the expanse of the forest feels infinite. There is a magical appeal to that wooded infinity, much like how you'd look over the sea and wonder what creatures reside at the bottom. I looked into the woods, seeing through increasingly small sightlines as the trees stretched on, and wonder what those trees could be hiding. I suppose that's why I started working as a park ranger. I liked how the mystery inspired me to think outside of my comfort zone. You'll hear so many stories in your lifetime. Whether you're roasting marshmallows around a roaring fire, or polishing off some beers in your buddy's basement, someone is inevitably going to try and scare someone else. Chances are, one of these stories will take place shrouded in darkness, deep in the forest. Tales of unassuming hikers falling victim to an angry Bigfoot, or any other collection of cryptid. Mysteries of people vanishing without a trace, only to be found miles away in some impossible location. The forest isn't mean, nor is it kind. It just is. I started a job as a park ranger a few years ago, and have since seen many things that could be weaved into a story around the fire. Strange creatures lurking just out of eyesight. Odd vanishings with no real explanation to them. These are the kinds of things you typically avoid reporting. Reports without substantial evidence or cause are thrown into a desk somewhere, without hesitation. If there's nothing that can be done about a case, then the higher-ups don't want to be bothered with it. Even when it comes to missing cases, you would be surprised how often someone goes missing, and the paperwork is shuffled to the side. It took me months to convince anyone above me that we needed to set up trail cameras that we would be able to stream to a control center. It was a solid month of going to work and walking the trails to find local wildlife had been mutilated. I would come across carcasses visible from the trails that would appear to have their stomachs ripped open. The organs would be pulled around. Only the bones of the animal's rib cage would be missing. For the entire month, this would happen nearly every day. Sometimes, I would even find multiple bodies. It was always the same thing, gutted with the ribcage missing. I saw one of the most impressive bucks I'd ever seen, ripped apart like it was a chew toy. Large and prideful antlers had been snapped, fragments of them laying around the body like snow. It was upsetting to see, such a pride creature reduced to ribbons. It got to the point to where I was screaming in the face of anyone that would listen. We had trail cameras up, but they were old and would only activate when they sensed motion, saving the footage to the camera itself. They were outdated and inconvenient. Whenever I would review the footage from the trail cameras near discovered bodies, there was never anything to see. Sometimes, at best, a blur would pass by and the animal would scurry off, but it was impossible to make out what it was. As if finding all the dead animals wasn't enough, whenever one was found, there was a pattern of destruction in the area, almost like a trail leading to the deceased. There would be deep grooves dug into the bark of trees. The grooves would have a dry substance that looked like molasses, but felt like rubber. We sent the substance off to a lab, something I was surprised was being paid for, but the results were always inconclusive. They said it was blood, but couldn't explain the unusual properties. There would also be several deep pockets of dirt dug into the ground. They would sometimes be deep enough that I could stand in them and have the surrounding dirt be at the level of my knees. It wasn't until I had to spell out the obvious that they started listening to me. When I positioned that if something was able to mutilate animals, that evolved to survive in the woods at such a pace and remain undetected, then just imagine what it could do to visitors. Visitors equals tourism. Tourism equals money, and people can't spend money if they're dead. Furthermore, no one wants to go to a forest where people are being found gutted like they got their autopsy prematurely. Another few days went by, another few bodies found. 2 rabbits were found laying directly on the path by some visitors that arrived right as we opened. Luckily, the mother was able to divert her child's attention before she spotted the gruesome end. That would have been a potential lawsuit for sure. I assured her that that was unusual, lying through my teeth, grinding a grin. I told her that I would see to removing it. It was after cleaning up and heading back to the small shack I call my headquarters so I can feel more important that I found a brown box sitting on my desk. Running a knife through the tape and lifting the cardboard flaps, I was pleasantly surprised to find a healthy number of new trail cams. They were green rectangles of validation. They almost looked too fancy, and there were so many of them. It felt impossible to think that Park Services shelled out the money necessary for them. My requests for much cheaper amenities have gone unanswered or outright denied multiple times. But here I was, with a box of around 24 trail cameras, ones I hadn't even seen on the market during my research. Just looking at them, though, they no doubt fetched a pretty penny. I was thankful for the diligence I demonstrated during the month. On the wall of my headquarters, I had a general map of the forest, and decorating that map was an assortment of 50 or so red X's. Each X was the location of a dead animal that was found gutted with rib cage removed. I also had small lines that showed the scarring of the trees leading to the animal. Along with this box was a small one that opened and revealed a small metal box that looked like a VCR. Quickly figuring out that it was a server that the cameras were going to stream through, I hooked it up and decided the best place to put the cameras was putting them where the victims were, clustered together. It seemed pretty sporadic, but there were spots where the X's got denser. I decided to use 12 cameras to observe the areas where clusters were, making sure to try to get decent angles. The other 12 would be placed further away to try to create a kind of perimeter around the site. It took a while to get done. Multiple times I would have to travel back to headquarters to double-check my work. I wasn't a fan of being out there when the sun was going down, but I was close enough to finishing that it didn't make sense to stop. When I had finally placed the last camera, I started heading back to the main trail when I heard a rustling quickly circle me. I didn't catch sight of anything and cursed myself for not setting up the servers so the cameras I just put up were recording. Not wanting to mess with anything that could splice open a creature 5 times my weight, I hurried my pace and got back to the cabin. Well, I mean headquarters. Placing the server box on the desk and hooking it up to the computer and monitor that could have easily been 100 years old, I clicked through one camera after another. I was startled when I clicked through the cameras and found a deer staring right into the lens of one, its eyes glowing a piercing green with the assistance of the camera's night vision. It was admittedly pretty cool to watch the amazing wildlife walking around in real time, just doing what they do. Although, as I clicked through the cameras, it became apparent that having just one monitor was an issue. The time it took to cycle through 24 cameras left way too many blind spots. I could display multiple cameras on one screen, but eventually, the pictures would get too small to see anything. After an uneventful night flipping through cameras, one image blending into the next until they became one blur of green and gray, I headed home. Before heading in the next day, I grabbed 2 monitors that were sitting around my house, and then another that a friend wasn't using. I got to work and did my usual rounds. Either there wasn't an animal carcass this time around, or I just wasn't able to find it. Checking all the cameras with the benefit of the bright sun beaming through the trees, I took notice that none of the cameras had a logo on them. There was nothing to identify the brand or model, not even a serial number. It was odd for sure, but I wasn't in any position to bite the hand that fed me, especially considering they permitted me to stay in the headquarters overnight, which was highly unusual. I couldn't help but feel my superiors were being held on a tight leash by someone. The day went on agonizingly slow, but eventually the tourists started to disperse and the sun started to dip. Beams of sunlight sifted through the forest, casting their final breath as the sun dropped below the horizon. With stars dotting the sky, I prepared for a long night, throwing a blanket over myself and turning on all the monitors. It wasn't a perfect setup, but I had enough to have one of them displaying one camera at a time that I could flip through. The rest of the monitors had 8 different cameras. The program allowed me to set hotkeys, so if anything caught my eye on the screens, I could type the camera number in and switch right to it. I felt like some kind of FBI agent trying to capture a drug mule. It felt honestly pretty cool doing a stakeout on something I had a hand in creating. An hour or two went by, flipping through cameras, when I first caught sight of something odd. It was quick, but out of the corner of my eye I saw, on one of the monitors, that something had walked by. Looking at the map behind me, now with numbers next to the red X's, I tried to figure out what camera would catch the blur next. I saw that camera 13 would lead into camera 16, if whatever it was continued going the same direction. Then I typed in the camera number and sure enough, in the distance, I could see a figure moving towards the camera. Sitting up, I focused in. Finally, about to see what had been causing the wildlife so much grief, the anticipation faded into disappointment as the figure got closer and revealed itself to be a person. With a sigh, I leaned back into my chair, frustrated that I had gotten my hopes up over some wanderer. Never liked dealing with people who are in the park after dark, but with whatever was running around, I couldn't risk just letting it go. I reached over and grabbed my flashlight. As I was standing up from the chair, I felt the ping of deja vu. The sensation was just enough to keep me from taking my eyes off the screen. I recognized what he was wearing. The gray button-down shirt tucked into his pants that were either brown or green. I could never decide. But it definitely was a park ranger. What the hell? I whispered to myself, observing the camera. I briefly thought about who was scheduled to work. I knew for a fact that the only other ranger that was doing any final walk at the park at this time had been gone for 2 hours at least. I'd seen his truck pull away, and the only car left in the parking lot was my own. Wondering what another ranger would be doing out here so late, I held off on going to confront them. The other ranger bent over and placed his hands on the ground like he was doing something, his fingers sifting through the dirt. It wasn't the best quality, but I was able to see him curl his fingers and plunge them into the dirt. Pulling his arm back, he clawed up a mound of dirt before repeating the process with his other hand. He continued doing this, picking up pace of his digging. I watched pixels of dirt flying behind him. As he dug deeper, I couldn't help but wonder how his fingers weren't hurting. Night can make the dirt pretty cold and coarse, honestly. Just as that thought crossed my mind, I felt a sting developing on my fingertips, like hundreds of tiny pins pressing in. Lifting my hands, I felt the flashlight I had been holding slip out of my hands. The thud of it hitting the floor was followed by the sound of dirt hitting the hard wood. Looking at my fingers, I was perplexed to find that they were now caked in cold dirt. A dark brown was now present under my fingernails as the stinging sensation grew more painful. Quickly wiping my hands on my pants, dropping the layer of dirt off, I was able to see small abrasions foaming on my skin. The stinging stopped and I was compelled to look back at the screen as the park ranger started walking off camera. It took a few clicks to find another camera that was capturing him. Eventually I came across a camera showing his face. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing. If it wasn't for the dirt still lingering on my fingers, I would think someone was trying to prank me. It wasn't exact, but the face of the park ranger, it was me. I was standing out there on camera, on a live feed. My chest started to tighten as cold washed over me. Here I was standing out there in the cold, with no jacket on. I could feel that chill running down my arms. I could even feel the pulse of the wind that I could see pushing the foliage around. I think I was saying something out loud, but I was so enamored that I couldn't remember what I was saying. I watched myself on the live feed looking around. The way my neck moved around was quick and jittery. I could almost feel my neck muscles starting to ache. Lifting my hand to put pressure on the sore spot forming on my neck, I watched stunned. I looked like an animal out there. The way my head moved, I could imagine a noise catching the doppelganger's attention, causing him to look in his direction. He lifted his head, as if finally getting a whiff of what he was looking for. Using the same type of quick movements, my copy dropped to the ground again and started digging vigorously into the ground. The icy cold of the dirt wrapped around my fingers once again, but this time, I could see it happening. The dirt was just appearing out of nowhere, painted onto my fingers as if by some invisible brush. My jaw clenched up. The cold was hurting more than the rough dirt until the pain started to dissipate. Once it felt like my fingers were starting to go numb from the cold, I was mortified to find out why their numbing was necessary. The copy of me walked over to the tree that was still in view of the camera, and much like the dirt, he dragged his fingers across it. I couldn't feel anything at first, but he did this again and again, placing his fingertips on top of the bark of the tree and dragging them across like a dog trying to claw through a door. I held my hands up so I could watch the doppelganger and my fingers at the same time, so I could watch my fingernails splinter and chip away slowly. The numbing helped me, but by the time I could see my skin starting to split open, thin trails of red running from open skin, the pain was starting to override the cold. Behind my fingers I could see him continuing, unfettered by the pain, clawing deeper and deeper into the tree. Eventually, well through the bark, I could see sections of the skin on my fingertips starting to splinter and fall off. By now, the trembling had gotten so bad my hands were almost a blur. The numbing the cold had offered vanished, and all that was left was a dragging, phantom agony. Blood and skin coating the rest of my hand and wetting the dirt. The doppelganger only increased how harsh his actions were, and I started seeing bone underneath the flesh. I started falling backwards. The pain was now running through my whole body, nerve endings desperately telling me to stop what I was doing, but I couldn't. I just had to bear it as the tips of my fingers were sanded away until I could only see white protruding. My mouth had become so vicious with saliva that it was hard to get my screams out. Each inhale nearly drowned me. Falling to the floor, even the bone started to transform. The more rounded tips were being dwindled. The pain never really stopped, but the bones became pointed like spikes. I could tell the dragging had ended. It was a struggle to get up, my fingers still on fire, and mangled to a point that I could no longer use them to brace myself. Trying to do so caused exposed nerve endings to scream on contact. Finally, back on my feet, I saw myself lowering his stance, his eyes glowing against the night vision, a predator ready to pounce. Looking at the map, I could see the direction his attention was. Camera 5. My exposed bone hung over the number on the keyboard. I had to see what was going on, what was going to happen next. With a heavy breath, I ripped the band-aid off and pressed down on the key, switching the camera, but also sending a shock through my system. I shivered from the sensation, but I was right. I could see my doppelganger, and more importantly, the buck standing in front of the camera. He was so fast. The version of me on the screen was so eerily quick that the camera struggled to keep him in focus during the pounce. My copy flattened his hand and shot it forward like a spear, piercing the skin of the buck. My eyes nearly rolled into the back of my head, feeling the echo on the impact. The other hand was soon to follow. One hand retreated and the other went in, alternating over and over again. I don't know how much longer I could take, what I could do to stop it. Maybe turn off the TV. What would help me? I don't know. Soon enough, the buck fell over. It barely seemed to put up a fight, like something had paralyzed it. My copy bent over, using the holes it had already created, and pulled open the buck's stomach. My body must have gone into shock as the sensation didn't seem to reach me. As expected, he reached into the buck and started pulling out whatever organs were in it. At least, now I would find out. I would know why that ribcage was the only thing taken from the animals. With a strength I knew I didn't have, my doppelganger reached into it with a snap, retrieved a bone. I could feel my arm muscles tense up as he was pulling out bone after bone. Bizarrely, he lifted two of the larger-looking ribs and placed them on top of his head, almost mimicking horns. Then, seemingly satisfied, he put the bones in his mouth and started to chew on them, just like my fingers. I could feel bits of my teeth flak off, and the rest of my tongue and gums as he ate the bones. The act of eating them started making my teeth ragged, replacing the pearly whites I had before with mangled fangs. It didn't hurt much until the teeth had broken, to the point that nerve endings were showing, and it was like a pain I've never experienced. It shot directly to my brain and had me buckling to the floor. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. As the echo continued eating one bone after another, I couldn't tell if the sharp cuts running down my throat were from the shattered teeth or the sensation of the copy swallowing broken bones. Before the copy could finish, though, my body had enough, and against my will, my eyes shut, and the world went dark. I woke up in a hospital, slowly snapping back to the world of the living. The hum of overhead lights ushered me in. A cursory movement of my tongue revealed that what I had experienced wasn't a dream. I instead had a smooth line of teeth. I felt jaded and twisted teeth more suited for a predator. Moving my fingers, I could still feel the sting of the wounds. I could tell that the bones were still exposed, pointed fingertips that were more like weapons now. Even my skin had taken on a pale complexion. The doctors informed me it was because of dehydration and a deficiency of calcium. No matter what I ate or drank, though, over the week I spent in the hospital, my skin never shifted a shade. They kept me there as long as I could, but they said, other than my teeth and fingertips that rejected any skin grafts, I was healthy. In fact, I was more than healthy. My muscle mass had increased, and brain scans showed unusually high brain activity. Everything in the hospital, I could hear it all, smell it all. Every sensation that I took for granted before was amplified. I could smell a blood test from the other end of the hospital as if I was a shark. Something happened to me. I'm different now. That night changed me. From what I've heard, the instances of animals being gutted stopped that night. I think of that night often now. Nothing seems to satisfy my hunger. Nothing is quenching my thirst. And more than anything, there is this nagging sensation that has been growing. It's at the top of my head. It feels like something is trying to grow there. Every time I focus on the sensation, I am reminded of my doppelganger, placing the rib bones on top of his head. I thought before he was mimicking horns, but I think antlers would be more appropriate. Much like how you'd look over the sea and wonder what creatures reside at the bottom. I looked into the woods, seeing through increasingly small sight lines as the trees stretched on, and wonder what those trees could be hiding. Thanks for listening to this creepy and downright horrifying park ranger horror story. Much love and appreciation to my friend AuthorJoJo, who wrote this great and perplexing story. If you enjoy his writing, definitely check out the links in the description. See some more of his stuff. He has a lot of good stories out there that I think you'll enjoy. I've narrated 3 or 4 of them at this point on this channel alone. If you enjoyed this story, please be sure to hit that like button as it helps me out a ton. The more likes this video gets, the more YouTube promotes it in its algorithm, and that helps me out a lot. If you're new to the swamp, why not join us? Hit that subscribe button, and be sure to turn on notifications to never miss a new video, as I upload them almost every single day, and all things natural and supernatural. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, whether it's a park ranger story or something different, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that help keep this show going on a daily basis. If you're not aware, you can download your favorite scary stories from the swamp on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, and everywhere else you find your favorite podcast online. And the best part is it's absolutely free. If you guys want to support the swamp outside of hitting that like button and subscribing, maybe check out our merch store. I've got exclusive Christmas-themed merch up for sale right now. As always, after the holidays are up, they'll no longer be for sale, so definitely grab one before it's too late. I have face masks, t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, and so much more. Thank you guys, as always, for supporting the swamp the way you do. I couldn't do this without you guys. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.